My name is Leonard Hargrove, though most people just call me Len. And at the age of 76, I find myself living in a house that feels far too large for a man of my condition. Yet I cannot abandon it because every corner carries the scent and shadow of the life I once shared with my late wife, Eleanor. The house is a one-story wooden structure built in the 50s, painted cream with green shutters that have faded with time, and it sits at the edge of a quiet suburban street where the sound of children used to be part of the daily music. But now, the kids have grown, the neighbors have changed, and silence rules most of my days. I am not blind, not yet, though the world without my glasses is a blur, a shifting mass of shapes and colors that melt into one another, until I cannot tell my own reflection from a shadow on the wall. Those glasses, thin gold-rimmed, with lenses so carefully chosen by Eleanor on the week of our 40th wedding anniversary, are more than a tool for seeing. They are the last gift she gave me before her heart betrayed her one winter night as she stirred soup in the kitchen, the same kitchen where now I eat alone with a trembling hand. Wondering why the rooms seem colder with every passing year, my days are ritual, not because I planned them so, but because routine is the only thing that stops me from collapsing into the loneliness that echoes whenever the clock strikes another hour. I wake early, though there is no reason to, the alarm clock unnecessary, because my body insists on opening its eyes at 6 every morning. I shuffle to the kitchen, lean against the counter until my knees stop trembling, and brew coffee in the old percolator Eleanor bought at a yard sale in 1972. I measure the grounds as she taught me. 3 spoons, never heaped, and just enough water to keep the flavor strong, but not bitter. Then I sit by the window with the same newspaper I have read for decades, though my eyes struggle over the print, and the words blur until I have to hold the page close and tilt my head so that light falls across the lines. Without my glasses, the world is a fog, yet I have always known where to find them, because they never leave the small wooden tray beside my bed, a tray Eleanor carved with her own hands during a crafts fair long ago, her initials carved into the bottom. I polish the lenses with a cloth every evening before sleep, as though keeping them clear can keep the memories clear too, as though by guarding those glasses I am guarding the last part of her. I once had a family that filled the rooms with voices, but time and choices, theirs more than mine, changed all that. My daughter, Margaret, is a woman of 48 now, ambitious, sharply dressed, her life run on schedules and profits. She works in some corporate office downtown, but I never understood exactly what she does, because whenever I asked, she would dismiss my questions with a smile that felt like a warning, as if the details were too complex for an old man like me. Her husband, Dennis, is a man with a face that always seems carved from stone, polite when necessary, but indifferent otherwise. And though I tried for years to reach him, to find some point of common humanity, he always treated me as an obstacle in his wife's path, a piece of furniture too heavy to discard, but not worth moving. Together, they have 2 children, a boy of 19 and a girl of 17, my grandchildren, whom I once held in my arms when they were infants, soft and warm against my chest, their tiny fingers curling around mine as though it were their whole world. Now they barely look at me when I see them, their eyes always glued to phones, their laughter reserved for friends I do not know. And when they do speak, it is often in the form of half-irritated sighs, as though the presence of their grandfather is an inconvenience to be endured until the evening is over. There are moments when I tell myself not to judge them harshly, because the world has changed, and perhaps it is natural for youth to distance itself from age. But there is another voice inside me that whispers more cruelly, "They do not care. They do not see you. You are nothing but a relic of another time." I try to silence that voice with memories of when Margaret was young, when she would climb onto my shoulders as we walked along the pier, when she would run to me with drawings from school, her hair tied in ribbons, her laughter echoing like bells. Across the yard, I remember holding her as she cried after scraping her knee. How she clung to me as though I were the only safe place in the world. To reconcile that child with the woman she has become is a task too painful for the mind. So I avoid it. I let the past live in one room and the present in another. And I try never to open the door between them. The truth is, after Eleanor passed, Margaret grew distant in ways that shocked me, as though her mother's death severed not just one bond, but two. As though with Eleanor gone, she saw no further need to maintain tenderness with me. It began subtly, with fewer visits, then phone calls that turned into text messages, then text messages that became nothing at all unless money was involved. At first, I gave willingly because she was my daughter, and because Eleanor always said family must help family. But soon I realized that every encounter began with a need, a request, sometimes disguised as concern. "Dad, are you comfortable with your savings?" she would ask. And when I assured her that I was fine, she would pause, sigh, and then reveal that tuition bills had come, or repairs were too costly, or Dennis needed funds for a project that would double in value if only he had the capital. I told myself it was natural, that parents are supposed to give, that perhaps this was my role now. Yet with every check I wrote, with every account I dipped into, I felt a piece of dignity dissolve. And in the silence after the transfer, I always wondered whether she would have called at all if not for the money. So my life narrowed, not by choice, but by erosion, like a shoreline eaten away by the tide, until only a thin strip remains between the waves and the cliffs. My days are spent inside these walls, with my books, my radio, and the photographs that stare back from their frames. Sometimes I walk to the park 2 blocks away, but only when the sun is kind and the pavement dry, because my knees do not forgive me if I push them too far. I sit on the bench where Eleanor and I once sat, feeding ducks, listening to children shriek with joy. And though those children are strangers now, I pretend they are echoes of my own grandchildren, echoes of the time before everything shifted. Yet I do not allow myself to speak to them, not in this world where an old man approaching a child is met with suspicion. I remain seated, silent, hidden behind my newspaper and my glasses, the world shrinking and hardening around me. I often think about the fragility of vision. Without those glasses, my world dissolves. Faces lose their features. Letters become smudges. Colors smear together until I cannot trust what I see. And perhaps that is why they mean more than any possession I own. They are not just lenses. They are my last link to clarity, not only in sight, but in memory. I polish them with care, set them gently in their tray, and each night before I close my eyes, I whisper a small prayer of gratitude to Eleanor, to fate, to anyone listening, for allowing me to still see the world in its edges and details. But there is a creeping fear, one that keeps me awake some nights. What if the world takes them from me? What if one morning I wake and find only the blur? What if the last gift of my wife is lost, and with it, the last line of defense between me and the abyss of confusion? That fear, unspoken, is what makes me cautious when my daughter visits. She comes rarely, but when she does, she walks through the door as though she owns it, her eyes scanning the room, always looking at the table where my glasses rest. I have seen the way Dennis glances at them too, not with affection or curiosity, but with calculation, as though even these small gold-rimmed lenses could be transformed into leverage, in some plan I am too naive to understand. And though I tell myself that paranoia is the disease of the elderly, I cannot silence the suspicion that grows each time I catch those looks. I wonder, in the quiet of night, if perhaps they see my weakness more clearly than I do, if they measure every tremor of my hand, every pause in my speech, and file it away for some future argument. Still, I hold on to dignity where I can. I keep the house clean, though slowly, one room at a time. I cook simple meals, soups, and stews that last for days. I keep track of bills, taxes, and repairs, though I know Margaret expects me to fail so she can swoop in with offers of help. I refuse to let her see me stumble, because once I surrender to that image, I will no longer be a man in her eyes, only a burden. Yet even as I fight this quiet war, I cannot deny that I long for something simpler. A visit without demands, a conversation without subtext, a dinner where my presence is valued for itself. It is a longing that burns, but never cools. And though I pretend otherwise, it leaves me vulnerable, because each time they call, each time they invite me, I tell myself maybe this time will be different. Maybe they will see me, not as an obstacle or a wallet, but as a father, as the man who once held their world together with his two hands. It was early in the spring, one of those evenings when the light lingers longer than you expect, stretching across the street until shadows fall lazily on the pavement. And I was sitting at my kitchen table staring at the crossword in the newspaper, my glasses balanced carefully on the ridge of my nose, when the phone rang with the kind of insistence that immediately told me it was not a casual call. Few people phone me these days. Fewer still stay on the line long enough to hear my voice. But when I picked up, I recognized Margaret's tone at once, the clipped syllables, the faint trace of irritation, even when she was trying to sound cheerful. "Dad," she said, "we want you to come over for dinner this Sunday. Dennis and the kids will be there, and it would be nice if you joined us." I cannot recall the last time she extended such an invitation without a pretext, without some request for help hidden behind the words. And for a brief moment I felt the old warmth stir. The memory of family dinners when Eleanor would lay out roast chicken and mashed potatoes, and the children would chatter about their school days while I carved the meat and poured glasses of milk. Yet even as that warmth rose, suspicion tugged at me, a whisper that asked why now, why after months of silence. Still, I agreed, because loneliness has a way of dulling suspicion, and the promise of company, even if tainted, seemed too precious to dismiss. Sunday arrived, and with it the awkward ceremony of preparation, the small decisions that suddenly seemed monumental. Which shirt looked least faded, which pants did not sag at the knees, whether to wear my old blazer despite the worn elbows. I polished my glasses twice, though they did not need it, and packed a small bag with the photographs Eleanor had loved, thinking perhaps I could show the grandchildren, remind them of a history that belonged to them as much as to me. The walk from my car to their front door felt longer than it was, and when Margaret opened the door, she did so with a smile too rehearsed, the kind that showed her teeth but not her eyes. Dennis appeared behind her, shaking my hand firmly, too firmly as though asserting his dominance, and the children looked up from their phones long enough to nod, before disappearing into the living room where a television murmured with some show I could not follow. Dinner was already set on the table, plates arranged with precision, wine glasses gleaming in the overhead light. Margaret fussed over me as though I were a guest of honor, guiding me to the seat at the head of the table, pouring me a glass of water before I could ask, and insisting I try the roasted vegetables she claimed were cooked the way Mom used to do. Them. I wanted to believe her, but the flavors were not Eleanor's, and though I smiled and nodded, I felt the distance between memory and reality grow wider. Conversation was polite, too polite, each word chosen as though part of a script, Dennis asking perfunctory questions about my health, Margaret interrupting with small corrections as though my answers were unreliable, and the children staring down at their plates with expressions that betrayed boredom. I laughed at a joke Dennis made, though I did not find it funny, and I told myself not to ruin the evening, not to let my unease show. Halfway through the meal, Margaret leaned toward me, her eyes narrowing as she reached across the table. "Dad, are those the same glasses you've always worn?" she asked casually, though the casualness was a disguise, her voice laced with something sharper. I adjusted them on my nose and nodded. "Of course they are," I replied. "Eleanor gave them to me years ago." She smiled faintly, exchanging a glance with Dennis, who shrugged as though this confirmed something between them. "You know," she said, "you've been misplacing things a lot lately. Maybe you should let us help you keep track of important items so you don't get confused." My fork paused midway to my mouth, and I searched her face for mockery. But she looked back at me with the serene confidence of someone planting a seed. I forced a chuckle, muttered something about being perfectly capable, and turned back to my food. But I could not shake the feeling that I had just been measured, weighed, and catalogued. After dinner, as we sat in the living room, I tried to speak with the grandchildren, asked about their studies, their plans, but their answers were clipped, as though my questions were an intrusion. Margaret brought coffee, setting my cup on the low table directly beside me, though she placed everyone else's in their hands. When I reached for it, my hand trembled slightly, and a drop spilled on the saucer. She seized on it with a sigh. "See, Dad, this is why we worry about you." I wanted to protest, to tell her a trembling hand is not incompetence, but I held my tongue, sensing that every word would only add to whatever narrative she was constructing. Dennis suggested a game of cards, and though my eyes struggled to follow the suits in the dim light, I played, determined not to falter. Yet at one point, when I misread a club for a spade, Margaret laughed lightly and said, "It's fine, Dad. You don't see as clearly as you used to." The children snickered, and though the moment passed quickly, the humiliation remained like a stain in my chest. When I finally returned home that night, I set my glasses carefully in their tray as I always did, but sleep eluded me. I replayed the evening, the glances, the insinuations, the laughter at my expense. It was not just a family dinner, I realized. It was an examination, a trial in disguise, with Margaret and Dennis as judges and the children as silent witnesses. They were watching me, recording every tremor, every hesitation, every mistake. For what purpose, I could not yet fully admit to myself, but the suspicion pressed on me like a weight. I thought of Eleanor, how she would have defended me, how she would have silenced Margaret with a look. But she was gone, and I was left to fight alone. The following morning, as sunlight filtered through the blinds, I reached for my glasses and felt my hand touch something wrong, something too light, too smooth. Instead of the familiar weight of Eleanor's gift, my fingers closed around a pair of plastic frames, brightly colored, absurd in their childishness. The kind of toy you might find in a cereal box or tucked into the corner of a party favor bag. I froze, my heart pounding as I held them up to the light. The lenses were nothing but cheap, transparent plastic, warped and useless, and for a moment the room tilted, the floor slipping beneath me. I searched the tray, the nightstand, the floor, but my real glasses were gone. Panic rose in my throat, a panic I had not felt since Eleanor died. And I sat on the bed, gripping the toy frames, trembling. I called Margaret, my voice unsteady, demanding to know whether she had seen my glasses, whether perhaps I had left them at her house. There was a pause, then laughter in her voice as she said, "Dad, those have always been your glasses. Don't you remember? You've been wearing those silly things for months." I protested, my words tumbling over each other, but she only sighed and repeated, "You're confused again. We'll come by later to check on you." When the line went dead, I sat in silence, staring at the toy glasses in my hand. The world beyond me already blurring into indistinct shapes. It was then I understood. The dinner had not been an act of reconciliation, but the opening move in something darker. The first hours after discovering the ridiculous toy glasses were consumed by disbelief, for I could not accept that something so vital, so personal, so entwined with the last memories of my wife, had been exchanged for a piece of plastic meant for children's play, and yet no amount of searching in drawers, behind furniture, under cushions, or in the laundry basket revealed the truth I already feared. My real glasses were gone. I walked from room to room, holding the toy frames in my hand, staring at them as though by sheer force of will they might transform back into the gold-rimmed lenses Eleanor had chosen for me. With such care, the world around me, stripped of clarity, dissolved into watercolor smudges. Edges lost their definition, and my own reflection in the hallway mirror was nothing more than a shifting ghost. I tried putting the plastic frames on, but the lenses warped everything grotesquely, distorting walls into slants and faces into masks. And I tore them off with a cry of frustration. My heart pounded, not only from panic at my blindness, but from the deeper terror that this was not an accident, that someone close, had deliberately taken what was most essential to me. By the afternoon, Margaret and Dennis arrived, stepping into my house with the air of caretakers inspecting a failing patient rather than a daughter and son-in-law visiting family. Margaret's eyes went immediately to the toy glasses lying on the table, and she picked them up with exaggerated gentleness. "See, Dad," she said, "these are the glasses you've been using, don't you remember? You wore them at dinner just last night." I shook my head vehemently, anger trembling in my voice as I insisted she was wrong, that I had never in my life owned such ridiculous things. Dennis exchanged a look with her, the kind of look that speaks without words, and then he said slowly, "Len, maybe you're confused. It happens. It's nothing to be ashamed of, but we need to face the fact that you forget things more often these days." The calmness of his tone only deepened the wound, for it was the calmness of someone building a case, a prosecutor laying out evidence, and I felt the ground tilt beneath me as though my own daughter were testifying against me in a court where I had no defense. I tried to retrieve the photographs I had brought to their house the night before, hoping that by showing them, by anchoring myself in tangible memories, I could break the illusion they were weaving. But when I reached for the envelope I had left on the coffee table, it was gone. Margaret said she had never seen it, that perhaps I had forgotten to bring it in the first place, and Dennis chuckled softly. "You've probably left it at home. Don't worry about it." Yet I knew I had set it there, had seen the edges of Eleanor's handwriting peeking through, and the absence now felt like proof that I was being stripped piece by piece of all evidence of clarity, all reminders of the life I had lived. That night, as I sat alone in the dim light of the lamp, I tried to read one of the books Eleanor had loved, her favorite collection of poetry. But without my glasses the words were blurred beyond recognition, mere shadows of letters swimming on the page. I squinted until my head throbbed, my eyes watering with the strain, and finally I gave up, laying the book down with a weight heavier than its cover. Reading had been my refuge, the last pleasure I could access without leaving the house, and now even that was denied me. I felt the humiliation of dependence pressed down, for I could not even read a line of print without those lenses. The next day, Margaret returned alone, bringing the grandchildren with her under the guise of a cheerful visit. They burst into the living room with exaggerated energy, their voices too loud, their laughter brittle, and one of them immediately spotted the toy glasses on the mantel where I had left them. "Grandpa, are those yours?" the boy asked, lifting them with a grin. "They look like something from a clown costume." The girl giggled and put them on, posing dramatically. "How do I look, Grandpa? Just like you?" Margaret laughed softly. "Come now, don't tease him. Those are his glasses. He's just embarrassed about it." My protest rose hot in my throat. But when I tried to insist that those were not mine, Margaret laid a hand on my arm, the weight of it patronizing. "Dad, please, don't make a scene in front of the children. We all know how hard it is for you to accept changes." I sat in silence after that, unable to defend myself against the tide of mockery. And the children continued to laugh, pretending to squint and stumble, bumping into furniture as though mimicking blindness. Margaret did nothing to stop them. Instead, she leaned back on the sofa, sipping her coffee, her expression calm, satisfied even, as though this was part of the performance she intended them to remember, proof of their grandfather's decline. The humiliation burned deeper than I thought possible, because it was not just the theft of my glasses, but the theft of my dignity, the rewriting of my identity from a man who once worked, provided, read, and thought clearly into a caricature of weakness. In the following days, the pattern became clearer. Margaret called often, not to ask about my well-being, but to remind me to take my medication, to ask whether I had eaten, to suggest she might bring groceries. Her words dripped with false concern, and though to an outsider they might sound like the dutiful care of a daughter, to me they were chains, each syllable reinforcing the narrative that I was incapable of managing my own life. Dennis visited once with papers in hand, contracts he claimed were insurance updates that required my signature. My suspicion burned as I squinted at the blurred lines, unable to read them, and when I asked what exactly they contained, he smiled too broadly and said, "Just standard forms, Len. Nothing complicated. You can trust me." I refused to sign, citing the need for my lawyer to look over them, and for a moment his face hardened, the mask slipping to reveal irritation, even anger, before he quickly recovered with another tight smile. By the end of the week, I had begun to dread each knock at the door, each phone call, for I knew they were not visits of love, but inspections, attempts to catch me faltering, to document every moment of hesitation. I overheard Margaret whispering on the phone one evening as she thought I was asleep in the armchair. She stood in the kitchen, her voice low, but not low enough. "Yes, I think it's working," she said. "He's getting confused more often, forgetting details, and the glasses are helping. The kids believe it now, too. If we can get the doctor to see it, then the rest will follow." I sat frozen, my body stiff with the terror of understanding, for her words confirmed what my heart already suspected. This was a plan, deliberate and careful, not an accident, not the natural course of aging, but a scheme to paint me as incompetent. That night, alone in the silence of the house, I wept not only for myself, but for Eleanor, for the shame she would have felt to see her daughter twist blood into betrayal, to see our love and our sacrifices reduced to strategy and manipulation. I thought of the vows I had made to her as she lay in her hospital bed during her final illness, how I promised to look after Margaret, to support her, to always be her father. Now those promises mocked me, for it was my very loyalty that had armed them with the weapons they used against me. Still, somewhere deep beneath the despair, a small spark of resolve began to stir. They had taken my glasses, but they had not yet taken my mind. And though the blur around me made the world uncertain, I began to see something else more clearly. They were not simply neglectful or selfish. They were preparing to erase me, to declare me unfit to seize the remnants of what Eleanor and I had built. And if I did not fight, if I allowed their laughter and their whispers to define me, then they would succeed, and the last of my dignity would vanish like ink washed from the page. The breaking point came a week later, though in truth the ground had been eroding for days, each humiliation and insinuation carving away at what little confidence remained until I was standing on the edge of collapse, and it took only the smallest push to send me into the abyss. Margaret insisted that I come to their house for Sunday dinner again, and though I wanted to refuse, though every instinct told me I would walk into a trap, the loneliness of the week had hollowed me out so deeply that I accepted, telling myself I would be vigilant that I would not allow their tricks to unsettle me. I dressed carefully, polishing my shoes until the leather gleamed, adjusting the toy glasses on my nose because I had no other choice, the world around me a blur without them, though their distortion made me dizzy and nauseous, and I prayed silently that no one beyond that household would see me wearing such foolish things. When I arrived, the house was alive with voices, but they were not the carefree sounds of family. They were low, hushed tones, punctuated by forced laughter. And when I entered the dining room, I noticed at once that the table was already set, not only for the family but for two strangers. A man in a gray suit sat stiffly, a leather folder on the chair beside him, and a woman with a neat bun and a clipboard rested across her lap. Margaret introduced them too quickly, as if rehearsed. "Dad, this is Mr. Carver, an attorney who helps families with estate planning, and Ms. Lowry, a social worker who works with elder care. They just wanted to talk with you, nothing formal, just a conversation." My heart lurched, for I knew then that the whispers had crystallized into action, that I was no longer merely being mocked or tested, but formally assessed. They smiled at me with the rehearsed sympathy of professionals, their voices soft and measured, every question designed not to gather truth, but to expose weakness. "How old are you, Mr. Hargrove?" the woman asked, as though my age was not a fact, but a puzzle I might fail to solve. "What day of the week is it?" asked the lawyer, his pen hovering above the paper, as if ready to record a misstep. I answered each question slowly, forcing my trembling voice into steadiness, reciting dates, names, addresses, even the name of the street where I was born, determined to prove myself intact. Yet when they asked me to read a paragraph from a sheet placed in front of me, the blur of words danced and shifted on the page, and I could not distinguish the letters. Margaret leaned in, her hand on my shoulder, her voice low. "It's all right, Dad. Just do your best." I clenched my fists under the table, rage boiling beneath my skin, because I knew that my inability to read was not the result of memory loss, but the theft of my glasses. And yet here in this stage trial, it was being wielded as proof of decline. The children watched from the doorway, smirking as though it were a show, and Dennis stood with his arms folded, a faint smile of satisfaction curling on his lips. When I stammered that the print was too small, that I needed my real glasses, Margaret quickly intervened, telling the strangers, "He's had trouble remembering which glasses are his. Sometimes he insists he owns another pair that doesn't exist." They nodded knowingly, scribbling in their notebooks, and my protests sounded weak even to my own ears, like the babble of a man desperate to cover his mistakes. I wanted to stand, to shout, to throw the toy glasses across the room and demand justice, but I was trapped by the blur, by the certainty that if I lost my composure, it would serve as the final confirmation they sought. By the time the meal was served, my appetite had evaporated, and I sat picking at the food while the others conversed around me as though I were already absent, a shadow at the table. The lawyer spoke of guardianship, the social worker mentioned support options, and Margaret nodded thoughtfully, her hand occasionally brushing mine, as though this were all an act of compassion. My chest ached with the weight of betrayal, for it was no longer hidden beneath layers of politeness. It was open now, shameless, my daughter openly conspiring to strip me of authority over my own life. And yet even as despair threatened to overwhelm me, another feeling sparked, small but fierce. Defiance. If they thought I would surrender quietly, they had forgotten the man who once built this family with his hands, who once worked 2 jobs to keep food on this very table. When I returned home that night, I closed the door and leaned against it, breathing heavily as though I had escaped an ambush. My house, though lonely, suddenly felt like the last fortress, the only place where I still held dominion, and I vowed I would not let them breach it. I lit the old lamp on the desk, spread out papers before me, and though my eyes could barely make out the shapes of words, I traced the lines of Eleanor's handwriting on a letter she had written me long ago, her gentle scrawl reminding me of who I had been, who I still was. They could take my sight, they could smear my name, but I would find a way to fight, because to surrender now would not only betray myself, but dishonor the memory of the woman who had trusted me to live with dignity until the end. It was at that moment, in the solitude of my dimly lit room, that I understood the truth more clearly than ever. This was not simply a family dispute, not merely the thoughtless cruelty of children grown selfish. It was a battle for my very identity, a battle I could not afford to lose. The days after that humiliating Sunday dinner seemed to stretch endlessly, each one heavy with the awareness that I was being watched, measured, and slowly pushed toward a fate I had not chosen. And though the silence of my house usually comforted me, now it felt like a prison. For at any moment I expected the knock at the door that would signal the next assault on my independence. I moved carefully through the rooms, running my hands along the furniture, memorizing each step so that I could navigate the blur that surrounded me. And yet, despite all my efforts, I stumbled often, bumping into chairs or dropping utensils, and every mishap filled me with dread because I imagined Margaret and Dennis filing it away as evidence of incompetence. At night I lay awake, staring into the darkness, the toy glasses lying on the tray, like a grotesque symbol of my captivity. And I wondered how long before they returned, with more strangers, more papers, more traps. It was during one of those sleepless nights that I resolved to listen more carefully, to watch even through the blur, for I suspected that they would make a mistake, that their arrogance would lead them to speak too freely, and I would be ready. My chance came sooner than I expected. Margaret began visiting more frequently, sometimes with Dennis, sometimes alone, and on one such afternoon I pretended to nap in my chair while they stood in the kitchen whispering. Through the thin walls I caught fragments, but the fragments were enough. Doctor's report, memory test, guardianship papers, and most chilling of all, once the house is in our name. My chest tightened as I realized the depth of their plot, for this was not merely about humiliating me in front of professionals. They intended to strip from me the home Eleanor and I had built, the walls that still echoed with her voice, the very last sanctuary I possessed. I stayed still, breathing evenly, until they left, and only then did I allow the tears to fall, silent and hot, because the betrayal was now undeniable. My own daughter, the child I had held in my arms when she was feverish, the girl I had worked double shifts to send to college, was orchestrating my erasure for the sake of property and convenience. Dennis I could understand, for he had never looked at me with anything but contempt. But Margaret, my Margaret, had crossed a line I had not believed she could cross. The weight of that realization crushed me. But beneath it, something hardened, a new layer of resolve that I had not felt in years. 2 nights later, the house became eerily quiet, the kind of silence that carries unease, and I wandered from room to room searching for some sign of comfort. I opened the cabinet where Eleanor had kept her sewing supplies, a place I had not touched in years, and there among the spools of thread and faded cloth I noticed a box I did not remember. My hands shook as I pulled it out, and when I lifted the lid, my breath caught. For there, buried beneath scraps of fabric, were my real glasses. The gold rims gleamed faintly in the lamplight, the lenses clear, not warped plastic, but the true windows to the world I had feared lost. I held them as though they were holy, pressing them to my chest, and for a long moment I could not breathe for the relief that surged through me. Yet the relief was soon poisoned by the certainty that they had been hidden deliberately, placed in that box by hands that knew I would not think to look there. I slid the glasses onto my nose, and the world snapped back into focus, sharp edges, clear lines, every shadow and grain of wood suddenly alive again. My tears blurred the vision, but they were tears of both joy and fury, for I knew now that I had been right, that I was not losing my mind, that the confusion and humiliation had been engineered. I stood before the mirror and saw not the ghostly blur I had grown accustomed to, but my own face, weary but intact. And in that reflection I saw the spark of defiance that Eleanor had always admired in me. I whispered to her memory, "They will not win, my love, not while I can still see." The next day Margaret arrived again, this time with a folder in her hand and an overly bright smile. She spoke of a family meeting, explaining that Dennis had arranged for another consultation with the lawyer and the social worker, and that it would be best if I signed some preliminary papers to make things easier for everyone. I asked calmly what the papers were, though my heart raced with suspicion, and she launched into a rehearsed speech about medical care, estate management, and peace of mind. She slid the folder across the table, urging me to sign, but I adjusted my real glasses deliberately, meeting her eyes with a clarity she had not seen in weeks. For a flicker of a moment her composure broke, and I saw the flash of alarm when she realized what I was wearing. "Dad," she said quickly, "where did you find those?" "You must be mistaken. Those aren't—" But I cut her off with a voice steadier than I thought possible, telling her I would not sign a single line without my lawyer present. She pressed harder, her tone sharpening, but I refused, and finally she left in frustration, muttering that I was being difficult, that I was only making things harder for everyone. That evening, as I sat with the folder untouched before me, I heard the phone ring, and when I picked it up I heard Dennis's voice, low and cold. He did not bother with pleasantries. "Len, you need to cooperate. You can't manage things anymore, and if you keep resisting you'll only embarrass yourself. Sign the papers." "It's the best option." I listened in silence, then hung up without a word, my hand trembling not from fear, but from the weight of the decision that had formed inside me. I would not wait for them to strip me piece by piece. I would take action first. The escalation came to its full measure at the so-called family meeting the following weekend, when Margaret and Dennis summoned me again to their house. I went, but not as the victim they expected. I wore my real glasses, though I kept the toy pair hidden in my pocket, and I carried Eleanor's old letter folded neatly in my jacket, a reminder of who I was. When I entered the dining room, the same lawyer and social worker were waiting, their expressions professional but expectant. Papers lay spread on the table, pens poised, and Margaret greeted me with false cheer, urging me to sit. Dennis began speaking at once, outlining the supposed benefits of guardianship, emphasizing safety, stability, and security, but I listened without interrupting, letting his words flow like meaningless noise. When the social worker asked me to confirm that I understood the purpose of the meeting, I nodded and reached into my pocket. With deliberate slowness, I pulled out the toy glasses and set them on the table. "My DVEs," I said clearly, "are what my daughter and her husband insisted were mine. They replaced my real glasses with these, told me I was confused, and used that lie to claim I was incompetent. But I am not confused. I am not blind. I see everything clearly now. The room fell into a stunned silence, Margaret's face blanching as the lawyer's eyes narrowed. I lifted my real glasses slightly, showing them, and then unfolded Eleanor's letter, reading aloud the words she had written years ago, her handwriting shaky from illness, but her love evident in every line. I read of her trust in me, of her belief in my judgment, of her plea that I live with dignity and never allow anyone to strip me of it. My voice wavered, but did not break. And when I finished, I looked directly at the strangers in the room and said, "Does that sound like the mind of a man who does not know his own life?" The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. The social worker glanced between Margaret and Dennis with a new wariness, and for the first time the balance of power tilted. Margaret stammered, trying to protest, but her words tangled, and Dennis's jaw tightened in silent rage. I had pierced the illusion they had constructed, and though I knew they would not surrender easily, I had struck the first blow that revealed their deceit. That night, back in my own home, I sat with the lamp burning low, my glasses resting firmly on my nose, and I allowed myself a rare smile. The war was not over, but the tide had turned, and I was no longer the helpless old man stumbling in the blur. I was Leonard Hargrove, husband, father, and man of sound mind, and though my enemies wore the faces of my own blood, I would not yield to them. The confrontation I had been dreading and preparing for arrived not in the quiet of my own house, where I might have gathered strength in solitude, but in the sterile air of a lawyer's office downtown, a place chosen deliberately by Margaret and Dennis because it carried the authority of polished wood, thick carpets, and shelves lined with volumes that no one ever really read, but that looked impressive to the uninitiated. They had summoned me there under the pretense of clarity, telling me it was time to finalize matters so that everyone could move forward without tension. And though every fiber of me recoiled at the thought of walking into their arena, I accepted, because I knew I could not spend the rest of my days waiting for the next ambush. The time had come to stand openly, to reveal their manipulations in the light of day, and to reclaim what they had been steadily stripping away. I dressed with deliberate care that morning, polishing my shoes until I could see my reflection in them, fastening the buttons of my blazer though my fingers trembled, and above all sliding my real glasses onto my nose, the lenses clear, the world sharp, the last gift of my wife gleaming like a shield. The office smelled faintly of lemon polish and dust, and as I stepped inside, I saw Margaret already seated, her back straight, her face calm, but her eyes betraying a restless flicker. Dennis stood beside her like a sentry, his arms crossed, his lips pressed into a thin line, and at the far end of the table sat Mr. Carver, the attorney who had previously come to their house, his pen poised above a thick stack of papers. To his left was the social worker again, clipboard at the ready, her gaze cool, as though she had already decided what story she believed. They motioned for me to sit, and I did so slowly, taking my place at the table not as a supplicant, but as a man determined to be heard. Carver began with practiced warmth, explaining that the documents before me were merely safeguards, provisions to ensure that I would be cared for should I ever become unable to care for myself. Nothing binding, nothing intrusive, just a measure of prudence. Margaret nodded as he spoke, interjecting occasionally with comments about how concerned she was for my well-being, how difficult it had been to watch me struggle, how she only wanted what was best. Her voice wavered at the edges as if rehearsing sorrow, and she reached across the table as though to take my hand, but I pulled it back deliberately, folding both hands in my lap. Dennis leaned forward at that moment, his eyes sharp, and said in a voice just low enough to seem intimate, but loud enough for the others to hear, "Len, you've been having trouble lately. Everyone sees it." the glasses, the forgetfulness, the mistakes, with bills. "We don't want you to embarrass yourself. Sign the papers. Let us help you." For a long moment I said nothing, letting their words hang in the air, letting them believe the silence meant surrender. Then I reached slowly into my jacket pocket, and with deliberate precision, I placed the toy glasses on the table, their cheap plastic gleaming absurdly under the office lights. The room fell still, Margaret's smile freezing on her face, Dennis's jaw tightening as if he had bitten down on stone. I adjusted the real glasses on my nose, leaned forward, and spoke in a voice that surprised even me with its steadiness. "These," I said, gesturing to the toys, "are what my daughter and her husband placed beside my bed, telling me they were mine, insisting that I was confused when I said otherwise. They tried to convince me that the real glasses I had worn for years, the gift my late wife chose for me, never existed. They made me wear these in front of my grandchildren. They mocked me. They brought strangers into my home to watch me stumble, and then they claimed I was losing my mind. But I am not confused. I am not blind, and I will not be erased." I reached again into my jacket and unfolded Eleanor's letter, the one she had written during her final illness. Her words shaky but clear, her faith in me evident. I read aloud, my voice thick but unbroken, the sentences in which she told me she trusted my judgment, in which she begged that I live with dignity and never allow anyone, even family, to diminish me. The words filled the room with a weight that no lawyerly phrasing could counter, and when I finished, I looked directly at the social worker and said, "That is my wife's testimony. That is my truth. Now you tell me, does this sound like the delusion of a man incapable of caring for himself, or the reality of a man betrayed by those closest to him?" For the first time, the social worker's composure faltered. She glanced at the toy glasses, at my real ones, at the trembling letter in my hands, and though she did not speak, I saw the doubt flicker in her eyes. Carver cleared his throat, shuffled his papers, muttered something about misunderstandings, but the authority in his voice had thinned, and Margaret rushed to fill the silence with frantic explanations. "Dad has been confused," she insisted. "He's mixing things up. He's paranoid. He found those toys somewhere and convinced himself of a story that never happened." But the urgency in her tone betrayed her, and Dennis's glare only hardened the impression of guilt. I rose slowly from my chair, pressing my hands on the table, and said, "If you want to take my house, my name, my dignity, you will have to do it in open court before strangers who can judge us all. No more whispers, no more staged dinners, no more lies. I will not sign a thing. I will not give you what you seek. And if you persist, I will tell the world what you have done." My voice shook, but not with weakness, rather with the fury of a man who has been cornered too long and has finally chosen to fight. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by Margaret's shallow breathing and Dennis's clenched jaw. Carver finally closed his folder, muttering that perhaps it would be best to revisit the matter at a later time, and the social worker, after a pause, said she would need to conduct her own independent review before making any recommendation. It was not a victory in the formal sense, no signatures, no proclamations, but it was a shift, a crack in the wall they had built, and I saw it in their eyes. They had not expected resistance, and now they would have to rethink their entire strategy. When I left that office, stepping into the bright sunlight of the street, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders for the first time in months. The war was not over, but the battle had been fought, and I had stood, not as a relic, not as a confused old man fumbling with plastic toys, but as a husband who remembered, as a father who still saw, as a man who would not be erased. And in that sunlight, behind the clarity of Eleanor's gift, I felt her with me, steadying me, whispering that I had done what was right. In the days after that confrontation at the lawyer's office, I moved through my house with a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. For though the battle had left me drained, it had also given me back something I thought I had lost forever. The certainty that my voice still carried weight, that my dignity could not be stolen by deceit, and that the truth, when spoken plainly, had a force greater than all the papers and signatures they had tried to place in front of me. Margaret called twice more that week, her voice tight and brittle, urging me to reconsider for the sake of peace. But I heard in her words the collapse of her confidence, the faltering of a plan that had seemed so certain to her only days before, and I told her calmly that I needed no more meetings, no more documents, that if she wished to see me it would be only as a daughter visiting her father, not as an adversary trying to strip him of his life. She did not reply, and after a long silence she hung up. And though the sound of that click carried grief, it also carried release. For I knew then that I was no longer bound to the endless cycle of manipulation. I spent hours cleaning the house, not because it was especially dirty, but because I wanted to reclaim it, to touch every surface and remember that it was mine. The walls built by my labor, the floors walked by Eleanor's careful steps, the rooms, once filled with laughter that had been genuine, not calculated. As I dusted the bookshelf, I placed my real glasses carefully on my nose and opened one of the volumes I had abandoned weeks earlier. And the words leapt up at me sharp and clear, the lines of poetry ringing with renewed power. I read aloud to the empty room, my voice unsteady but full, and in that moment I felt less alone, as though Eleanor herself were sitting across from me, smiling faintly at the sound of her husband reclaiming his voice. It was not long before I made the decision that had been growing quietly inside me, a decision Eleanor would have understood, to sell the house and leave the city where my memories had been twisted into weapons against me. I contacted an old army friend who lived 2 states away, a man I had not seen in years, but who had written faithfully every Christmas. And when I explained my situation, he welcomed me with a warmth I had not felt in years. The arrangements took weeks, but in that time I felt my strength returning. For every box I packed was not a loss, but a liberation. Every drawer emptied was a step away from the stage where my humiliation had been performed. When the papers were signed and the sale complete, I locked the door one final time, stood on the porch where Eleanor had once planted roses, and whispered goodbye, not in sorrow, but in gratitude for what the house had given me before it was poisoned. By betrayal, I did not tell Margaret or Dennis where I was going, nor did I feel the need, for I owed them nothing now. The inheritance they had coveted was gone, scattered into the cost of my new life, and the chains they had tried to wrap around me had dissolved with the stroke of my own signature. I drove away with my glasses secure on my nose, the world sharp around me, and for the first time in many years I felt as though the road stretched ahead, not into decline, but into possibility. My friend greeted me at his modest home with a hug that nearly broke my ribs, and that night we sat together on his porch, drinking coffee and watching the sun set over the hills, and I told him everything, the lies, the humiliations, the plastic, toys, and he listened without judgment, his silence a kind of balm I had long craved. The children did not call, nor did Margaret, and though a part of me still longed for reconciliation, I understood at last that some bonds, even those of blood, cannot be repaired when they have been poisoned by greed. I mourned the daughter I once believed in, the family dinners that had been real, the laughter that had not yet been corrupted, but I also understood that mourning did not mean surrender. In the faces of my friends' grandchildren, who visited often and who treated me with the innocent respect that comes from seeing an elder as a storyteller rather than a burden, I found something like renewal, a chance to pass down what I had learned, without fear of mockery. Sometimes at night I take off my glasses, polish them carefully with the cloth Eleanor had sewn for me, and hold them up to the light. They are more than glass and metal. They are the proof that I was never blind, that the fog was not in my mind, but in the lies that others tried to drape over me. And when I slide them back onto my face, I feel a clarity that goes deeper than vision. I whisper to the silence, "I see now, Eleanor, and I will never again let them cloud my sight." And in that moment, whether she hears me or not, I feel her presence, steady and proud, walking with me into the life that still stretches ahead.